Hi, I'm Sean Tierney. I'm happy to be here at LINHAC to do a state of the hockey analytics industry talk. Really want to say thank you to Patrick Lambrix and the LINHAC organizing committee for putting this together and for giving me the opportunity to speak about the hockey analytics industry broadly and Sport Logic in particular. So we'll dive in. First, just a couple words about myself. My name's Sean Tierney. I'm the Director of Hockey Services at SportLogic. We're a data provider that is working across the NHL and AHL, SHL and Hockey Allsvenskan, the CHL, USHL, and many other leagues around the world. Before my time with SportLogic, I was charting hockey on Twitter and had my own website for NHL and prospects, data and visualizations. And prior to that, and alongside that, I was the director of analytics for the Hamilton Bulldogs in the OHL. Still like to point out that the Bulldogs won the championship in the OHL in my first season with the team, which I like to take an undue amount of credit for. And also want to just sort of cross our fingers for the Bulldogs that are playing in the OHL championship this season, which maybe disproves how important I thought I was to that initial championship run now that I'm gone. So for today, I want to take a few minutes to share a few categories of thoughts on the hockey analytics industry, broadly speaking. I'll start with where we've been as a community, as an analytics community, and how industry and analytics has come into that picture. Talk a little bit about where we are, where I see the hockey analytics community today, and then finish up with where we're going next, what I think the challenges are, where the opportunities lie, and what the next steps are going to be for hockey analytics and sports analytics, broadly speaking. And try to remind myself to leave some time for questions at the end of this as well, which is not always my specialty, but I will do my best. So where we've been, as someone who has been around the hockey analytics community now for most of a decade, I'm certainly not one of the first people through the door, but I've been around long enough to see how the hockey analytics community in particular has grown, both public and private. If we look back to some of the early days, if we go way back, we have stats by hand. And we know if you're in the business of sport, the idea of counting wins, goals, assists, these are things that have gone on for as long as we've had the sport. But within the 2010s, we had play-by-play data become available in public for the NHL. That led to a wave of interest around expanding the statistics that were available to evaluate teams, to evaluate players. So we saw an expansion of the offerings. People like War on Ice and each of those initial creators, Sam Ventura, Andrew Thomas, Alex Mandrycky, have all gone on to prominent roles with NHL clubs or with SMT now for Andrew. We saw this explosion of new data getting deeper, seeing the shot attempts that teams or players had, the ways that different line combinations performed when they were together, the types of shots, the distance of shots that goalies were facing. We got this initial wave from the play-by-play data on the public side that allowed the industry to begin to grow, to turn into a place where analytics or advanced data had a role to play. So with this development of true hockey analytics, providers came into the scene as well. And initially, this wasn't what I was part of, but from the outside looking on, could see how there was this market growing for some of the providers that remain in the space today. SportLogic is one. The Instats, the Stathletes, the Sport Contract, the Synergies. many of the other companies that we'll hear from over the next few days and later today as well, there became an appetite in sports, broadly and hockey specifically, to get access to analytics and to be able to go deeper into the data, um, to see what sort of insights could come. For Sport Logic in particular, in the industry as a provider, Chris Boucher was the driving force early on. His story is a long and interesting one that I won't touch here, but just sort of the drive he had to create a product that took video and looked for micro statistics and had a platform to house these micro stats. And the growth of Sport Logic is a testament to just how valuable that data and that inclination that Chris had was. He has since moved on to the San Jose Sharks, and then recently in the news, Chris accepted the role of director of hockey analytics with the Montreal Canadiens in his hometown. So, as much as this is about industry, we can see how the people who make up this industry have become key parts of, the most, the biggest organizations in the sport. Chris left this to Matt Perry, who's since moved on to become director of analytics with the Arizona Coyotes, leaving me sitting in the chair today, directing Sport Logic's hockey services. So for us, that's meant we've had a couple of regime changes and the ability to see this sort of institutional knowledge be passed on and grow to service all of our partners in all the different leagues that we work in. And so one other piece I want to speak to here about where we've been is there was an eye test versus analytics battle. And I think anyone watching along today and many of the other presenters will be able to speak to this. The analytics industry faced this battle in hockey from the eye test. The idea that scouts or GMs know their stuff and don't necessarily need fancy stats or analytics to tell them something they already know. This was a legitimate battle, and anyone with a Twitter account sort of suffered through this battle at times, or maybe for a long time, while this sort of war was waging. That's in the past now, I would say largely. And what we've seen is sort of this bridging between these two camps, that the data that can be provided in hockey is only valuable if it's providing the analytics depth that stats oriented people want to see, but also provides the tools and the understandability that the sort of experts in the field, the scouts and the general managers and the coaches of all these teams, that they can see the value and understand what these outputs are too. And again, through the lens of an industry panel, I think that's a real call to us to understand what the challenges are. Anyone who's spent time on computer vision and trying to sort of automatically extract data from video, the challenges there are great and complex, but just as great and complex is the adoption and acceptance that needed to come from one of the oldest and most traditional sports, both in Europe and in North America. And so we had this sort of bedrock of statistics that have become the jumping point for where the industry is today. The points, plus minus, Corsi early on, expected goals that had a lot of traction in European football first, and has been a sort of easy one to bring over to the similar sport of hockey in that way. And then the deeper data that has come kind of in that next wave. Started by looking at teams and players and goalies, and we've been able to get deeper and deeper and break it down by period, by situation, by time frame, by context, like line mates and opponents. And as we've been able to drill down providing these analytics, we've been able to move, I think, as an industry from disinterest, which I haven't listed here, to interest, to adoption, and we'll sort of trace that path as we go through. The last is, and the reason I've got this photo dropped in today, one of my favorites from the NHL playoffs in the past couple of weeks. we've come so far that the idea of fancy stats maybe 10 or 12 years ago was, you know, almost laughable that it would have the adoption that it has managed to have. It was restricted to the message boards of the internet. And now we have, you know, enough iPads that Chris Kreider can snatch one away from Mika Zibanejad and toss it, and you know, there's extra iPads around. You can go and grab another one. We've come so far to this point of live data on the bench that I think now that there's steam behind this analytics movement, there's a real opportunity for the providers here and for SportLogic in particular to drive this forward now that the momentum has been gained. So where we are today, for SportLogic in particular, I've kind of got a few notes going on in here. I think we've seen not only is the data that we provide through our UI, through our custom reporting, that isn't enough for our partners. Our API has become a key piece providing data and video. We've seen the expansion of data departments within teams. You know, some teams have 10 or a dozen staffers whose specific role with an organization is their ability to code and take in data and produce, whether it's reports, whether it's dashboards, to create these tools of insight within teams. We've seen the need for links to video sliced in virtually every way you can imagine. And that includes some of the providers like Huddle and Catapult that help coaches to slice up video, to some of the analytics providers in our sport and others that have realized the value of providing video, both as a teaching tool for players, as a systems tool for coaches to analyze, and as a real sort of ground truth touch point for the data that's being created. It's no longer enough to say we have the data. You need to be able to show it. You need to be able to say, here's where this event occurred. This is how we're counting it. So that link to video has become key to developing trust to communicate around the data. And I point to Tulsky here in my bullets just as a thought on how far this analytics movement has come to today, where Tulsky's name is regularly mentioned as a GM in waiting candidate if you listen to NHL podcasts. And this is a person who came up through hockey analytics and Twitter and in the blog sphere. And so somebody with his intense educational background and his familiarity with data and his love of hockey, these are the sorts of opportunities that are now available to people like Tulsky and many, many others that I'm not naming here. Another piece of where we are today is something I'll speak on a couple of times as we go. There's a tremendous tie between video coaches, data departments, front offices, management teams, and the data providers that they work with. It's no longer a siloed approach, at least from my lens. Video coaches need to have some understanding of what the data might be. Front offices need their coaches to be able to use the data to verify that what they're seeing is real. And providers need to be able to interface with all of these different people, speak their language, and provide their data needs in order to keep all of these pieces tied together and to provide the right kind of support for each. So these, again, are stories that SportLogic, even in my year and a half with the group, the number of conversations that I've been fortunate to be a part of where you're supporting these people with very different roles, vastly different responsibilities, all being powered through the data that can be provided to help them do their jobs better. And for SportLogic in particular, where we are today is seeing deepening ties with all the different partners we have in our different leagues. So for SportLogic, it's on the men's and women's side. And we've been very proud of our partnership with the PWHPA and providing data there, working with our clubs across pro and junior leagues, and just finding those opportunities to partner with staffs that are looking at ways to use data to drive their programs forward and be that sort of service on the other side to explain, to support, and to help them grow. A couple other places that we are today that bear noting. I think tracking data is something that's extremely relevant for the NHL and the SHL and for hockey broadly around the world. I think the sport has fallen a half step behind, maybe a full step, of the NFL, NBA, Major League Baseball, soccer in Europe, even F1, on and on. I think the NHL has the tracking data, and SMT has been a powerful partner with the NHL in creating this. But the adoption, the takeaways, um, we still are waiting for that wave of tracking data adoption to truly grow. So it's there, and we can point at it, and we know that it's started. But I think that there's, in this moment, we're looking at all the opportunity of tracking data without having seen exactly what form it will take for hockey. There are tremendous challenges here. How do data departments wrangle this? Do NHL and SHL and then amateur staffs have the right skill sets on board in their staffing to wrangle the overwhelming quantity of data that's going to come in, to understand what it means at all, to be able to find metrics that have meaning, to be able to take the data in and convert it and then display it in some meaningful way that helps with adoption, again, with those key staff members, the coaches, front offices. I think that this is a challenge we're still staring down. I'm really excited to listen to some of the other talks that are going to happen over the course of the LINHAC presentations, but I don't think it's something that we've answered yet. I don't think we have, true clarity on just how powerful the tracking data is going to be. It's something I'll speak to again in my where we're going slide. Last here, I think we're staring down, instead of that eye test versus analytics debate, we're looking more at descriptive versus predictive metrics and how systems, data, and video feed into each other in a sort of unending cycle. And so, it's powerful to be a Sport Logic data provider and to be able to say, I can tell you about the number of rim dump in attempts that were recovered on the weak side, how many people were involved in that puck battle, and whether or not that win led to a scoring chance from the slot. So very powerful, very granular, very detailed description of the possession sequence that occurred. Is this a predictive measure? Well, that's where we need to have these conversations and continue this growth in communication. We can track this data and we can provide it, but it's describing something that's happened and maybe doesn't have the predictive power that expected goals does for predicting, future goal scoring success. How do we continue to educate coaches and front office staffs on the difference in these kinds of data and which types of metrics do which jobs? Sport Logic, there are as many as between 3,000 and 4,000 metrics you might find in one spot or another. How do we understand which jobs these do at which times for which people? And then again, just I want to continue to point, and I think this is something I'm very focused on in the space, is those connective organizational webs where we have the coaches in charge of systems, we have the data teams circling around the data, and we have coaching staffs and management all working together, sort of crossing those lines of communication, more like a web than an up and down tower structure for communication, to make sure that the right information at the right time in the right way is being provided to the right people. Where we're going, and so I'll present this slide humbly, where I think Sport Logic goes next in this industry, but where I think the industry as a whole goes to, and I'll let the other really intelligent analytics people here speak for themselves. I'll just sort of cast a wide net here. I think the tracking data, as I said, is going to be really key. How do we get insights out of it? And what is that first wave of adoption we're going to see? For me, I think we've done a very good job of developing player evaluation tools. Tracking data is going to be a new piece in that, where things like speed and player routes and distance traveled and And that piece of player performance is going to loom large. But I think the tracking data ultimately is going to drive other areas into the light in places where the analytics that we have now can do pieces of the job, can indirectly point to it, but don't capture it the way that tracking data may be able to. How can we use this for player training programs to say, take those optimal routes we see from players that do certain things in the best ways? How can we provide that to player development coaches to ensure that developing players, whether it's pro or amateur, get the training support they need? What information do we get about load management, which almost feels like a dirty word in the post Kawhi Leonard space, but that idea that 82 game seasons, or long seasons in other leagues that don't play 82 like the NHL, how do we find that right balance of rest versus playing time to ensure that player performance is managed? Pointing to the NBA, we see how players are hanging on longer there. Primes that used to be brief, that used to be 24 to 27 years old as a real peak phase, that maybe there's the opportunity to lengthen these out to make longer prime careers for top players. Load management via tracking data may be a piece of that story. And then I think maybe the most compelling part of this is injury recovery, something that's very tricky to get at with the data we have today. How can we set individual benchmarks on injury recovery for players? And how do we tackle those recovery plans? If a goalie goes down with a hip injury, what does that typically look like in terms of range of motion on their way back to playing full time again in the league? How do we see players come back from a shoulder injury versus a torn knee versus a concussion? All of these pieces in tracking data may help us set some benchmarks and some best practices for recovery paths. And I think any of those player development pieces that we can get at with tracking data, there's lots of gain and lots of low-hanging fruit in that space to look at. The next piece, I think, is quantifying the qualitative. And so in a sense, this is wandering back into the eye test versus the analytics warfare, but with newer tools. I think scouting notes are a place that interests me, where quantifying natural language via data is a place that I think there's a lot of gains that could be had, where scouting reports are turned into trackable, analyzable key phrases, and that players may be clustered by these notes that scouts are able to collect with their live viewings. One of my favorite graphics on intangibles comes from Garrett Hole and Mike Fail from HockeyGraphs from a few years ago. The idea of analytics doesn't measure the inputs like heart and grit and leadership, but it measures the outputs like clean entries or Corsi or expected goals, and it can measure the final results, goals, wins, saves. Can we now, with some of the tools that we have, begin to look at leadership or chemistry between line mates? Can we begin to evaluate systems and whether or not the system that a team is playing suits their roster, or is the optimal system at all? This question ties into my next point on systems. I think there's a lot of space in optimal strategies and optimal defensive and offensive sequences where data could be used to optimize strategy based on chains of events that we're able to identify in the tracking. This may be particularly powerful, and I'll always have a special eye for junior hockey and developmental leagues supporting pro. When you're in one of these junior leagues, you're not looking at major roster overhaul. There's no free agency period in that way, and trades are different. In a lot of cases, you have a roster and you're working with that roster. And so that means that a number of different strategies may be in play for you. And the analytics industry isn't here to prescribe this one way of playing hockey and it's that or it's not optimal. It's more about, or I think where we can get to is, what does this roster have? What do these men and women on this roster, what do they do? And what's the optimal strategy based on their archetypes? How can we get the most out of the players that we have here? And then the last piece that I'll mention for now is maybe the greatest challenge. I think that the analytics industry has at times suffered from being opaque, from struggling with clear communication that breeds adoption. And so I've pointed to this a couple of times, that I think clear presentation, whether that's through visuals, which are close to my heart, data visualizations can be key as a touch point for people who maybe are not as comfortable with analytics, but a takeaway in a chart is really quick, or a heat map. But beyond just the reporting or the data visualization piece, I think having the right people in the right roles to speak to the data um, is the biggest key of all, if adoption is going to continue to grow and insights are going to be gleaned. One particular case in the NHL from the past couple of seasons that I think of is the Arizona Coyotes hiring of former player Lee Stempniak as a liaison between the analytics team and the coaching staff. That's one, not the only, but one approach to making sure that hockey language wraps itself around the findings that data can produce, and helps to ensure that it's communicated in an actionable and non-threatening way. Um, I think that we're now in that moment where it's not enough to have tracking data. It's not enough to have very smart people with degrees who can crunch numbers. I think that differentiating quality has become the ability to then communicate it through a UI, through visualizations, through curated reports, or spoken. That key communicators are going to be needed to ensure that the analytics snowball we've got rolling continues to grow. So that's it for me. I tried to adhere to the timeline as best as I could for this presentation. Again, I want to say a special thank you to Patrick for all his work organizing LINHAC. Anyone who's ever attended a conference, you see bits and pieces of how much work this is. If you've ever been part of organizing a conference, you know what incredible work goes on behind the scenes to align everybody to be here across time zones on a day. So again, just want to thank Patrick for his tremendous work there. And I'll make myself available for any questions that I can answer with whatever time I have left. Thanks very much for this opportunity. Glad to be here today.
Thanks, Sean. You and I can have a little conversation now, a little about the questions. I have a few questions for you after your presentation. The first one is you talked about falling behind hockey. You said then to baseball, you talked about American football, you talked about soccer in Europe. Why is hockey following behind it? Is the interest not there, or is the money not there, or is it just the sign of the times?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I wish I had a really insightful answer. I think the other sports, at least in North America, have traditionally been bigger, had more money around them, had more ability to drive those things forward. So hockey was probably going to be number four out of those four, just in terms of size and the interest in the American market in particular. But someone's got to be last, and not far behind, and lots of quick gains. And sometimes it's nice to come after that initial waves. I think hockey analysts can learn a lot from what's happened in other sports and move really quickly and catch up based on the insights we can get from soccer and basketball and football. So it's not all lost. Maybe a step and a half behind, but I'm confident we'll catch up quickly as data keeps moving forward.
So I guess then that says that you believe the money sports, American football, baseball, soccer in Europe are ahead of hockey, just due to the fact that there's a financial standing in those sports that is stronger than hockey. That's truly proven.
Yeah, I mean, for the moment, and I'm really encouraged that we've seen hockey grow and hockey is catching up in that space. It might be number 4 in American interest right at the moment, and there's certain limitations that come with that. But it's made hockey analysts really sort of ingenious in the ways that they counter the lack of maybe initial resource. So again, I think we catch up really quick, and the people that are around this conference today, we can see how much brain power there is that's going to be applied to make up that gap.
Tracking data. You talked about a lot in your presentation. We had a conversation where you were part of the panel earlier today with analysts that work with the teams here in Sweden, 4 of them, and I asked the question at the end, what would you like? And tracking data came up. Can you explain what is tracking data? I mean, exactly. I mean, following people and or following the players. Is that tracking, or is it more than just following the players?
I think that's the big part of it. And when it gets sort of hand waved, what is this? We're talking about XY coordinates for all players at all times, all over the ice. And there's different ways to get at it. Having those, thinking of NFL football, having those chips in the shoulder pads so you know where somebody is up and down and on the field at all times. There's a lot of gain that can be done there. And I know it's just kind of the sexy term in data right now to say tracking data in sports in that particular way. But I do think it's important to say while we're looking at that kind of big data is a lot more than what any teams, I think in any sport, are truly ready for right off the hop. It's going to take big data teams with a lot of data engineering and data architects and data scientists to really transform this into something that is understandable, connects to the sport, and is something actionable for decision makers within a team. So, it's exciting. I want to see it get there, but it comes with its own slew of challenges that I don't think we've seen conquered yet in any of the sports.
We talked to the analysts or the team analysts. They also said that they were hoping that their crews or their colleagues would grow by 2, 3, 4, 5 people, maybe in 5 years. And what you're saying then is the timing may fit perfectly if the tracking data comes along in the next couple of years and each team is able to build their analytic team to being more than, at this point, one person for most teams. Then maybe they're right on sync for each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it ties back to the point about we might not have been the first sport to get to this sort of front edge of analytics, but we're catching up quickly. We can learn the lessons from the other sports and the ways that they've tried to manage this big data. Hockey knows what types of data departments are going to be needed when this tracking data is widely available and ready to be worked with. So like you said, it gives us that lead time for teams to hire 2 or 3 data engineers and be ready for it to integrate it into their processes quickly. That's a way that hockey is going to be able to sort of close this gap quickly if they take these lessons from other sports and apply it here.
Now, I may be thinking a little too easy about this. I worked with a hockey team and I was the CEO of a hockey team for many years. You say big data, lots of data. Does that mean that we need to change computers in all the arenas? We need to change the Wi-Fi systems in the arenas. We need to get better servers. We need to change everything to be able to take the big data, as you say.
Well, I like the lens that you're taking on this. Maybe there's an opportunity to get into computer sales here too before this wave of opportunity comes. For sure, the infrastructure in hockey arenas, anyone who's a junior hockey fan who's traveled the hockey arenas that there are around Europe and North America, upgrades to the infrastructure to make sure the Wi-Fi signal works all the way into the coach's room and all the way back up. Yeah, there's infrastructural challenges that are going to come here too. Again, I'm a bit of a broken record, but we've seen that this is what's coming. We know it's a couple of years out. Here's our chance to plan and to build the right teams and the right systems and be ready to capitalize right on time when this data lands. So, hopefully we learn these lessons and we're ready to capitalize when it's the right time.
Sean, thank you for participating. You're going to come back a little bit later. Thank you very much for your presentation and your time for questions.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.